In this video, we're going to take a look at a feature of Excel called pivot tables. Pivot tables are one of the coolest features in Excel because they let you do a lot of work with just a small number of clicks of the mouse. Pivot tables are used for summarizing data. The only time it makes sense to use a pivot table is if you have some repeating values in columns. Then you can summarize the data based on those repeating values. So in column A here, I've got the product repeating. I've got a number of rows for Brazilian coffee, a number for Turkish, and then down at the bottom I've got a number of rows for French. So all three of those repeat. So I can summarize on the type of coffee and basically collapse all of these rows down into 3 rows instead of 70, I think it's 72 rows. Yeah, 72 rows of data. I've also got repeating values in the month column, and I've got January through June, only 6 months. And in the region column, I've got 4 regions, north, south, east, and west. And then I've got a revenue value over here. So I have repeating values in column A, column B, and column C. So I can summarize on product, I can summarize by month, I can summarize by region. And we're going to take a look at all of those in our example here. So let's create a pivot table. Start off with the cursor someplace in the data, not up here in the title, but any place below that should work just fine. And it seems like this ought to be on the Data tab, but it's not. It's on the Insert tab. So click on the Insert tab, and then go to Pivot Table. And if you start off with the cursor in the data like this, you don't have to do anything here. It is smart enough to figure out. It's got the page name here. We can kind of ignore that. But we're going from A2 down to D74. And that's our entire data table. If I were to scroll down, you'd see it covers the entire data table. And we're always going to put them on a new worksheet as well. So if you start off here with the cursor in the data and click on Insert Pivot Table, you can just click on OK right away. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And it opens up a new worksheet for us. And this new worksheet looks a lot different from anything that we've seen before. We've got over here is just kind of a little template is where our pivot table is actually going to go. And over here, we've got pivot table fields. And when we are creating a pivot table, we get pivot table tools up here. There's one called Pivot Table Analyze, and there's one called Design. Now, design just has to do with the looks, and we're not going to pay too much attention to that. That's pretty straightforward. So we're going to be looking at some of the things on the Analyze tab, though. So before we get started here, I'm going to click someplace. So see, the cursor right now is here in this little area that's been set aside for our pivot table, which will expand. I'm going to click outside of it, though. And a couple of things happen when I do. We lost our ribbon up here. We lost our pivot table fields over here on the right. And if you're working on a pivot table and all that stuff suddenly disappears on you, all you got to do to get it back is just click over here in your pivot table, or if you haven't created the pivot table yet, in this area that's reserved for your pivot table later on. Okay? So we've got our data fields over here, and we're going to start off with something really simple. We want to know what our total revenue is by product. We've got 3 products. So I'm going to click on Product here, and as soon as I do that, 2 things happen. The word products appears down here in the rows box. I've got 4 boxes down here. And over here in column A, I've got 1 row for each one of my unique products. And I've got 3 products. So that's what I get. And now I'm going to click on revenue. Now, revenue is a number column. And if I click on a number column, it automatically goes into the values box down here. And we sum all of the numbers. And over here, whatever's in the sum of revenue, whatever's in this values box down here, will appear in column B. Okay. Now, I think it'd be kind of nice if it carried over the formatting from the page that we got the data from, but it does not. So I'm going to select all of column B here, and I'm going to format that with the accounting format. And these numbers are big, so I don't really need the decimal places. And now it's a little bit easier to read with the commas and the dollar signs. So it adds up all of those. There was 24 rows for each one of Brazilian, French, and Turkish. It adds up all 24 rows for Brazilian, all 24 rows for French, all 24 rows for Turkish, and it gives me those totals. And then down here, it gives me the grand total of all 3 of those numbers. So that's my total coffee sales for that 6-month period. Okay? Now, let's go back over to the right here, and let's just turn both of those off. We're going to do multiple pivot tables, one after another, all on the same worksheet here. If you need to have multiple pivot tables, you can create a new one every time, but we're not going to bother to do that. We will just delete what we have and we'll start from scratch. Okay? So now let's say what we want is we want the revenue by month. So I know if you know what your table is going to look like, you can pretty much figure out what you need to do over here. I want month in column A, and I want the total revenue for each month in column B. So let's click on month first because that goes in column A. Month appears down here. My 6 unique values for month appear over here. Revenue is what I want, so I'm going to click on revenue next, and it appears down here as sum of revenue. And in column B, I get the sum of revenue for each month and a grand total down at the bottom. And this is the same grand total that we had before. Okay, and the formatting is still here. If I put this on a new sheet, I'd have to start formatting all over again as well. So that's easy. Just click on month and click on revenue. Let's say I want it by region. Click on region, click on revenue. Region appears down here. Revenue appears over here. And I get my unique region values in column A. And I get the sum of the revenue for each one of those regions in column B, and a grand total of 2.83 million. Okay, so those are pretty straightforward. Now, let's try something a little bit more interesting. Let's say we want the product, but we want it broken down by months. Well, I want product in column A. Below that, I want each month. So I'm going to click on month. And it keeps that in column A, and it lists the unique months for each one of my products. And then I'm going to click on revenue, turn revenue on. And because that's a number, it goes down here in the values box. And now I've got all of my Brazilian coffee. This is in bold. If you take a look at the bold lines here, you'll see that those correspond to the products. And it gives me, it's basically summing these numbers. Instead of summing at the bottom like we usually do, it's summing them and putting them at the top. If you don't like that, there is an option under design here where you can have them move down to the bottom. Okay, so now I've got everything by product and by month. I can also, let's make this even more interesting, let's add in the region, okay? And if I add in the region now, I've got product, month, and then the 4 numbers for all my 4 regions for January for Brazilian coffee. Okay, and again, we've got some bold numbers here. Each coffee number is bold, and each month number is bold. And again, the month numbers are going at the top, not at the bottom. Okay, so now I've got kind of a long list here. So I call this a list format data table. You can also do, I'm sorry, not data table, pivot table. You can also do them in a table format, which we'll look at in another video. Now, this one's getting kind of long. There are some options for shortening it. One is you can just click on this minus sign here, and it collapses all the Brazilian stuff, collapse all the French, collapse all the Turkish. And when you do, it also changes the minus back to a plus. And then I can just expand them as I want. Again, I can do the same thing with the months, but I don't want to see all the months. I can click on the minus signs. But we're going to get rid of revenue here and just bring it back to, let me turn the plus signs back on here for French and scroll down here, and we'll turn on the plus signs for Turkish. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to turn revenue off. I meant to turn region off. Okay. And now we've got something that's a little bit easier to see. Everything fits on the screen, so we're good. So those are some of the basics for doing a pivot table in Excel and keeping it in a list format. And in the next video, we'll take a look at some options for creating a pivot table and viewing the data in a table format.